A waitress says to the Hells Angels, "Hello, sir, my mother has a tattoo just like yours." What? The stale scent of fried onions and weak coffee clung to the air of Pop's diner, a smell as familiar and comforting to Emily as her own worn-out shoes. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of lull between the lunch rush and the early dinner crowd when the fluorescent lights seemed to hum a little louder, and the clatter of silverware felt almost intrusive. Emily, 23 and perpetually tired, wiped down the sticky counter for the third time, her mind wandering to the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen table. Her life was a monotonous cycle of taking orders, refilling lukewarm coffee, and enduring the occasional lewd comment from a truck driver. She dreamed of something more, something beyond the chipped formica and the endless loop of classic rock on the diner's ancient radio, but for now, Pops was her reality. The bell above the door jingled, a sound that usually signaled a new customer, but this time it was different. It wasn't the light tinkle of a single person entering, it was a sustained, jarring clang, followed by a sudden, heavy silence that descended upon the diner like a shroud. The few regulars scattered at various booths froze, forks halfway to mouths, conversations dying on their lips. Emily's hand, mid-wipe, paused on the counter. The air outside had been filled moments before with a low, guttural rumble, a sound that vibrated through the very foundations of the building, now abruptly cut short. Then they entered. Not one, not two, but a group of 6 men, filling the doorway with their imposing presence. Their leather vests, heavy with patches and insignia, gleamed under the diner's unforgiving lights. Long, unkempt hair, often hidden beneath bandanas, framed weathered faces, etched with lines that spoke of countless miles and hard living. Beards, some braided, some wild, added to their formidable appearance. But it was their eyes that truly held the room captive, sharp, unblinking, assessing every corner, every person. The silence in Pop's diner became absolute, thick with unspoken tension. These were not the usual weary travelers or local eccentrics. These were Hell's Angels. Emily had seen bikers before, of course, riding through town on their way to some rally or another. But never like this. Never a full contingent, stepping into her quiet, unassuming diner. Her heart began to thump a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a primal response to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Her training, years of serving all manner of people, kicked in. Professionalism. That was the key. Treat them like any other customer, no matter how intimidating. The men moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied their bulky frames. Their heavy boots thudded softly on the checkered linoleum floor as they made their way to the largest booth in the back, the one usually reserved for large families or the occasional poker game. They settled in, their leather creaking, their presence dominating the entire space. One man, clearly the leader, sat facing the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the diner once more before finally resting on Emily. He was older than the others, his face a roadmap of scars and sun damage, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see right through her. A silver earring glinted from his left ear. "Coffee, black," the leader rumbled, his voice surprisingly deep but not loud, cutting through the silence like a knife. The other men offered similar terse orders, more black coffee, a couple of waters. No one asked for menus. They simply waited, their posture relaxed yet coiled, like predators at rest. Emily nodded, her voice a little shaky as she managed a quiet, "Coming right up, sirs." She turned and retreated to the safety of the counter, her hands fumbling slightly as she poured the coffee. Her mind raced. What did they want? Were they just passing through? Was this some kind of stopover? She tried to appear calm, her movements deliberate as she filled the mugs, the aroma of the cheap diner coffee suddenly smelling even more mundane against the backdrop of their powerful presence. She walked back to their booth, a tray laden with steaming mugs. Her palms were sweating. She placed each cup down carefully, trying not to make eye contact, focusing instead on the task at hand. As she reached the leader, placing his black coffee in front of him, her gaze, against her will, dropped to his arm. His left forearm was exposed, the sleeve of his leather vest pushed up, revealing a canvas of intricate tattoos. Her eyes scanned the various designs, a snarling wolf, a tribal band, a faded eagle. But then, her gaze snagged on one particular image, prominently displayed on the inside of his forearm. It was a skull, not just any skull, but a very specific kind. It was a winged skull, stark and menacing, with a helmet on its head and a pair of spread wings extending from its temples. The details were incredibly precise, the shading deep and dark, giving it a three-dimensional quality that made it seem to leap off his skin. It wasn't the official Hell's Angels' Death's Head patch, not exactly, but it was a variation, a style, an aesthetic that was undeniably tied to the club's iconography, a symbol of freedom and defiance. It was a design she knew intimately. A sudden, unexpected jolt went through her, a flash of recognition so strong it bypassed her carefully constructed wall of professionalism and fear. Her brain, still reeling from the shock of their arrival, processed the image with an almost childlike innocence, connecting it to something deeply personal, something entirely out of place in this intimidating scenario. The words, unbidden and unfiltered, tumbled out of her mouth before she could even register the impropriety, the sheer audacity of them. Her voice, though still a little breathy, carried clearly in the unnerving silence of the diner. She looked up, her eyes meeting the leader's piercing blue gaze, a small, genuine smile flickering on her lips, born of sheer, unthinking surprise. "Hello, sir," she said, her tone surprisingly casual, almost friendly. "My mother has a tattoo just like yours." The words hung in the air, echoing in the sudden, absolute stillness that followed. The leader's face, which had been impassive, hardened imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed, and the slight, almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders tightened. The other bikers, who had been quietly sipping their coffee or surveying the room, now stopped. Their heads slowly turned towards Emily, their expressions unreadable, a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and something far more dangerous. The clinking of a spoon from a distant booth, where an elderly man had been too engrossed in his pie to notice the new arrivals, suddenly seemed deafening. The old man, finally sensing the shift, looked up, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Emily felt a cold dread begin to seep into her veins, swiftly replacing her momentary burst of innocent recognition. The leader's gaze was no longer merely assessing, it was an intense, unwavering stare that made her feel transparent, exposed. The small, friendly smile on her face withered, replaced by a growing terror. What had she just said? The words replayed in her mind, stripped of their innocent context, now sounding incredibly foolish, provocative even. She had spoken to a Hell's Angel, a man whose presence alone commanded fear, and made a comment about his highly distinctive tattoo, linking it to her mother. The sheer absurdity, the potential gravity of her statement, began to dawn on her with sickening clarity. The leader remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stared, a silent question, a silent challenge in his gaze. The air around their table seemed to thicken, growing heavy with unspoken implications. The other bikers watched, their faces grim, some with faint, unsettling smirks playing on their lips. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and regret. She wanted to retract the words, to apologize, to disappear, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, her tongue suddenly heavy and useless in her mouth. She could feel the stares of the other patrons, the weight of their silent judgment, their shared apprehension. The old man with the pie had stopped chewing, his fork suspended in midair, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. The leader slowly, deliberately, lifted his coffee cup to his lips, but his eyes never left hers. He took a long, slow sip, the action drawn out, emphasized, a theatrical pause that stretched the tension to breaking point. The silence was agonizing, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerators and the frantic pounding of Emily's own blood in her ears. She felt a bead of sweat trickle down her temple, cold against her skin. She had made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but the full extent of its consequences remained terrifyingly unclear. What did a statement like that mean to men like these? What did it imply? And more importantly, what would their reaction be? Her mind raced, desperately trying to conjure an explanation, a way to defuse the situation, but no words came. She was trapped, caught in the unwavering gaze of the leader, her innocent comment having opened a door to an unknown and potentially dangerous confrontation. The leader finally lowered his cup, the faint click of ceramic against saucer echoing unnaturally loud in the profound silence. His piercing blue eyes, however, never wavered from Emily's. The slow sip had been a deliberate act, a calculated pause designed to amplify the weight of her words, to let them marinate in the thick air of the diner. Now, his gaze was no longer just assessing, it was probing, dissecting, as if trying to peel back layers of her skin to find the truth beneath. A muscle twitched almost imperceptibly in his jaw, the only outward sign of his internal processing. "Just like mine," he rumbled, his voice low, a gravelly whisper that somehow managed to fill the entire room, each syllable delivered with a chilling precision. It wasn't a question seeking information as much as a challenge, an invitation to explain the inexplicable. His eyes flicked briefly to his tattooed forearm, then back to Emily, a silent command for her to elaborate, to justify her audacious claim. The other bikers remained motionless, their collective attention now fully locked onto the exchange, their grim faces reflecting a mixture of suspicion and cold anticipation. Some leaned forward slightly, their leather creaking, their posture shifting from relaxed to predatory. Emily's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The cold dread that had begun to seep into her veins now surged, a tidal wave of terror washing over her. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly as dry as desert sand. Her earlier, innocent burst of recognition felt like a lifetime ago, replaced by a crushing awareness of her blunder. She had crossed an invisible line, stumbled into a dangerous territory where casual remarks held unforeseen weight. She desperately searched for words, for an explanation, anything to defuse the palpable tension that had transformed Pop's diner from a mundane eatery into a potential arena. "Yes, sir," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to her earlier, surprisingly casual tone. She clasped her hands together, a nervous habit, trying to steady them, to appear composed, but her fingers trembled visibly. The winged skull. On her forearm. It's very similar. Almost identical, actually. She got it a long time ago." The words felt inadequate, hollow, even to her own ears. How could she explain the profound coincidence without sounding utterly foolish or, worse, deliberately provocative? The leader's gaze intensified, his eyes narrowing further, a silent storm brewing behind them. A low growl emanated from one of the other bikers, a younger man with a shaved head and a prominent scar dissecting his left eyebrow. He shifted in his seat, his hand moving almost instinctively toward something hidden beneath his vest. The subtle movement sent a fresh jolt of fear through Emily. She instinctively took a small step back, her eyes darting between the leader and the menacing biker. The other patrons in the diner were now frozen, their expressions a mixture of fear and fascinated horror, their attention riveted to the unfolding drama. The old man with the pie had dropped his fork, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. "A long time ago, you say?" the leader repeated, his voice still low, but now laced with an edge of quiet menace. "And where exactly did your mother get such a specific piece of art? Because this isn't just some random design, girl. This is significant." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, bringing his face closer to hers, his blue eyes boring into her with an unnerving intensity. The silver earring glinted under the fluorescent lights, a cold, hard glint. Emily felt a desperate urge to run, to flee this suffocating atmosphere, but her feet remained rooted. She knew she had to explain, to somehow bridge the terrifying gap her innocent words had created. She never really talked about it much, sir," Emily stammered, her mind racing, trying to recall snippets of conversations from her childhood, vague memories of her mother's stories. "But I remember her saying it was from her younger days. When she was different. Before she settled down." She paused, searching for the right words, for a way to make sense of it all. She had a friend, a group of friends back then. They were free spirits, she called them. Rode motorcycles. The leader's expression remained unreadable, but the subtle tightening around his eyes suggested he was far from convinced. He exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with the younger biker, who now had his hand openly resting on the hilt of a knife tucked into his belt. The silent communication between them was chilling, a clear signal of escalating danger. "Rode motorcycles," the leader echoed, a faint, humorless smirk playing on his lips. "Is that what she called it? Free spirits?" He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that held no mirth. And this friend of hers, did he also have a tattoo just like mine, or was it perhaps your mother who was more intimately involved with the culture? His words were a direct challenge, a thinly veiled accusation, implying a deeper, more personal connection than Emily had initially let on. The casual way he pronounced culture was loaded with unspoken meaning. Emily felt a flush creep up her neck. Her mother, a quiet, unassuming woman who now worked as a librarian, had always been a mystery to her in some ways, a past she rarely spoke of. Emily knew her mother had lived a wilder life before Emily was born, but the details were always vague, shrouded in a protective silence. Now, that silence was threatening to engulf Emily in a very real, very dangerous way. I don't know, sir, Emily confessed, her voice thick with growing desperation. She only ever showed me hers. She said it was a symbol of something she believed in. Freedom. Loyalty. The leader's eyes narrowed further. Freedom and loyalty, he repeated slowly, tasting the words, his gaze unwavering. Very convenient. And what was your mother's name, girl? The question was abrupt, cutting through Emily's hesitant explanation, demanding a specific piece of information that felt like a key to unlocking a hidden vault. Emily hesitated. Giving out her mother's name felt like another irreversible step, another line crossed. But refusing to answer felt even more dangerous. She was caught between a rock and a hard place, her innocent comment having spiraled into a nightmare. Eleanor, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor Vance. The leader held her gaze for a long moment, processing the name. Then, he turned his head slowly, his eyes sweeping over the other bikers at the table. He didn't speak, but a silent message passed between them, a shared recognition, a flicker of something in their hardened eyes that Emily couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't exactly surprise, more like a grim confirmation, a memory stirring from the depths of their collective past. The air grew even heavier, thick with unspoken history. Eleanor Vance, one of the older bikers, a man with a long, graying beard and a missing front tooth, finally spoke, his voice a low growl. He looked at the leader, then back at Emily, his eyes holding a strange mixture of curiosity and something akin to respect, but still heavily tinged with suspicion. That name, it rings a bell, boss. The leader, whose face had been a mask of impassivity, now showed a flicker of something, a shadow passing over his eyes. He turned his attention back to Emily, his gaze now even more intense, less overtly hostile, but infinitely more unsettling. It was the look of someone who had just found a missing piece of a very old, very complicated puzzle. So, your mother is Eleanor Vance, the leader stated, not a question, but a declaration. He leaned back in the booth, a subtle shift in his posture that, paradoxically, made him seem even more imposing. He took another slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. And she has a winged skull tattoo on her forearm, just like this one. He gestured to his own arm with his chin. Tell me, Emily, does her skull also have a small, almost imperceptible chip on the upper right wing, near the tip? Emily's breath caught in her throat. The specificity of the question was staggering. She hadn't noticed such a detail on the leader's tattoo, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that her mother's tattoo did indeed have that exact flaw. It was a tiny, almost invisible imperfection that her mother had always joked about, claiming the artist had sneezed at the crucial moment. It was a detail so minute, so personal, that only someone who had seen the tattoo up close, or perhaps even been present when it was inked, would know about it. A cold shiver ran down her spine, not just from fear, but from the sudden, profound realization that her mother's past was far more intertwined with these dangerous men than she could have ever imagined. The leader wasn't just probing, he was testing, confirming, connecting dots that Emily hadn't even known existed. The silence in the diner stretched, now thick not just with tension, but with the heavy weight of a history about to collide with the present. Emily felt a profound sense of helplessness, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, her mother's secret suddenly threatening to consume her. She could only stare, her lips slightly parted, unable to form a response, the leader's piercing blue eyes holding her captive in a silent, terrifying interrogation. The fate of her immediate future, and perhaps even her life, suddenly hinged on the answer to a question she was now too terrified to voice, a question about a small, faded chip on a tattoo that had just bridged decades and worlds. The other bikers watched, their faces grim, their hands no longer resting idly, but subtly positioned, ready for whatever revelation was about to unfold. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder, a high-pitched whine accompanying the frantic pounding of her heart. Emily could feel the collective gaze of the diner patrons, a suffocating pressure of silent panic and morbid curiosity. The air, once stale with the scent of fried onions, now tasted metallic, like fear. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that her answer would either condemn her or perhaps, mercifully, offer a sliver of understanding, though she wasn't sure which outcome was preferable. The mystery of her mother's past had just walked into her diner, in the form of 6 intimidating men, and Emily was caught directly in its unforgiving path. Yes, Emily whispered, the word barely a breath, yet it carried with chilling clarity through the absolute stillness of the diner. Her voice trembled, a fragile thread in the heavy air. Yes, sir. It does. A tiny chip on the upper right wing. My mother always said the artist sneezed. The leader's piercing blue eyes, which had been fixed on her with an almost predatory intensity, softened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something akin to recognition, or perhaps a deep, buried memory, crossed his weathered face. The grim set of his jaw relaxed slightly, and for the first time since their arrival, the palpable tension in his posture seemed to dissipate, replaced by a profound, almost melancholic weariness. The other bikers, who had been poised like coiled springs, visibly eased. The young man with the scar withdrew his hand from the hilt of his knife, though his gaze remained sharp, watchful. The leader let out a slow, deliberate breath, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. He leaned back into the booth, the leather creaking softly, his gaze now distant, as if looking through Emily, into a past only he could see. Eleanor Vance, he murmured, the name a ghost on his lips. So, she finally settled down, huh? A waitress for a daughter. Life's funny that way. He took another sip of his coffee, but this time the action was devoid of menace, a simple act of a man lost in thought. She's a librarian now, sir, Emily managed, her voice still shaky, but a sliver of hope, a fragile sense of understanding, began to pierce through her terror. The leader chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that was surprisingly warm, tinged with a hint of irony. A librarian. From a wildcat to a librarian. That's Eleanor for you. Always full of surprises. He finally lowered his cup, placing it gently on the saucer. His eyes, now less intimidating, met Emily's. My name is Frank. Most call me boss, or chief. But Eleanor, she always called me Mac. Mac. The name resonated with a faint echo in Emily's memory, a name her mother had sometimes mumbled in her sleep, or in a rare moment of nostalgic reverie, always accompanied by a wistful sigh. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more complex and personal than she could have ever imagined. Eleanor and I, we go way back, Mac began, his voice taking on a narrative tone, a storyteller recounting a long-lost chapter. The other bikers remained silent, their attention rapt, some nodding slowly, others simply listening, their hardened faces reflecting a shared history. That tattoo, it wasn't just a design. It was a mark. A symbol of a pact, a promise. Back in the early days, when this club was just a handful of restless souls, searching for something more than the straight and narrow. Eleanor, she wasn't a member, not officially. We didn't have club women in the way some do now. But she was more than that. She was family. She was us. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, as if seeing ghosts of the past riding down the highway. She was a force, your mother. Fierce, independent, with a spirit that could outride any of us. She patched us up when we were busted, fed us when we were broke, and she never once asked for anything in return. She believed in what we stood for: freedom, loyalty, brotherhood. And that tattoo, that was her way of showing it. We all got a variation of it, a personal symbol of our commitment to each other, to the life. Mine's a bit different, a bit older, but the essence is the same. The winged skull. It meant we were bound, in spirit, to something larger than ourselves. And the chip, that was her own little rebellion against perfection, her way of saying she was unique, even within our ranks. Emily listened, mesmerized, a flood of emotions washing over her. A profound sense of shock, certainly, but also a strange pride, and a burgeoning understanding of the woman who had raised her. Her quiet, bookish mother, a librarian who smelled of old paper and Earl Grey tea, had once ridden with these men, had been a part of their dangerous, exhilarating world. The untold stories, the quiet silences, the wistful looks her mother sometimes gave to passing motorcycles, it all made a terrible, beautiful sense now. "She was a good woman, Eleanor," interjected the older biker with the missing tooth, his voice softer than before. "Saved my hide once, she did. From a nasty spill on the old Highway 17. Patching me up with nothing but a first aid kit and a bottle of whiskey. Tough as nails, that one." A wave of murmurs and nods rippled through the group, each man seemingly recalling his own memory of Eleanor Vance, the wildcat who had touched their lives. The atmosphere in Pop's diner had undergone a complete transformation. The suffocating tension had evaporated, replaced by a warm, almost familial camaraderie. The other patrons, who had been holding their breath, now began to stir, a collective exhalation of relief echoing softly through the room. The old man with the pie picked up his fork, though his eyes remained fixed on the Hell's Angels, a new blend of awe and wonder in their depths. Mac looked back at Emily, a faint, genuine smile gracing his lips. "So, Eleanor Vance's daughter. You got her eyes, girl. That same fire." He paused, then reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest. Emily's heart gave a nervous flutter, but the gesture was slow, deliberate, devoid of threat. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, thick and heavy. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the table. "Coffee's on me, Emily. And for old time's sake, keep the change. For your mother. Tell her Mac said hello. And tell her I still remember the way she could fix a carburetor with a hairpin." Emily stared at the money, then at Mac. The enormity of the gesture, the unexpected kindness, the sudden, profound connection to her mother's hidden past, overwhelmed her. Tears pricked at her eyes. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I will. I'll tell her." Mac pushed himself up from the booth, his movements still deliberate, but now imbued with a sense of purpose rather than menace. The other bikers followed suit, their heavy boots thudding softly on the linoleum once more, but this time, the sound was comforting, not intimidating. As they filed out, each one offered Emily a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the shared moment, the unexpected bridge built between their worlds. The young man with the scar even offered a faint, almost shy smile. The bell above the door jingled again, a sustained, jarring clang as the last biker exited, followed by the familiar, low rumble of powerful motorcycle engines starting up outside. The sound vibrated through the diner, no longer a harbinger of fear, but a fading echo of a past revealed. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they were gone, leaving behind only the scent of leather and exhaust, and a profound, life-altering silence. Emily stood there, rooted to the spot, the $100 bill clutched in her trembling hand. Her mind reeled, trying to process the encounter, the revelation. Her mother. Eleanor Vance. The quiet librarian, the woman who had always seemed so ordinary, so predictable, had once lived a life of wild freedom, riding alongside these men, a vital part of their formidable world. The tattoo, once a mysterious, intriguing mark, was now a vivid emblem of a past she had never known, a secret history that had just walked into her diner and laid itself bare. She looked down at the counter, at the sticky residue of spilled coffee, at the worn formica, at the stack of bills still waiting on her kitchen table. Her life at Pop's diner, once a monotonous cycle of orders and refills, now seemed imbued with a new depth, a hidden layer of possibility. She still dreamed of something more, beyond the chipped formica and the endless classic rock, but now, that dream felt less like an escape and more like an exploration. She had a mother to talk to, a past to uncover, stories to finally hear. The stale scent of fried onions and weak coffee still clung to the air, but it no longer felt quite so stale, quite so mundane. Emily looked at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing not just a tired waitress, but a woman standing at the precipice of a newfound understanding, a woman whose world had just expanded in the most unexpected and extraordinary way. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to sing a little louder, no longer a lament, but a quiet, hopeful melody, signaling the dawn of a new chapter in her life, one where the whispers of the past had finally found their voice, and the ordinary had revealed its extraordinary heart. She picked up the $100 bill, a tangible link to a world she was only just beginning to comprehend, and a quiet, determined smile finally bloomed on her face. The stacks of bills on her kitchen table still awaited, but now, Emily felt she had a whole new story to tell, and a new strength to face whatever came next.